It's an interesting time to be a British citizen. Given how the events of the previous year have affected the UK, as well as the proceeding with Brexit, I'm uncertain how the future of this country will play out. But do not fret, for there's always video games. Specifically, 2 games that discuss government control. One that explores history through fiction, and another that takes inspiration and explores life in a post-Brexit future. This is the exploration of nationalism through games. The time spent in our homes over the past year has been stressful, to say the least. It's been hard not to think about the state of the UK, how poorly we've responded to events of the past year, how desperate our government is to leave the EU, how things will turn out when we go back to what was previously normal. Brexit was a terrible idea, and the reasons for its occurrence are somewhat obvious. Brexit was the result of a terrible conservative government baiting the politically ignorant into a policy that's nationalistic, and one that will only worsen the lives of the people living in the UK. The months spent indoors have given me the time to revisit these 2 specific games, providing a space for me to ponder over the Brexit policy. The first game is Papers, Please, an experience that's beloved by many, and one that I got to appreciate in a way that I previously didn't. The other game is Not Tonight, a successor in spirit to Papers, Please, repurposing its gameplay for a different political topic. The question is, does it work? Well... Papers, Please, the dystopian document thriller, arguably one of the biggest hits in the indie scene, and perhaps one of the most iconic in video game history. Born from Lucas Pope's interest in turning a job into a game, Papers, Please is successful in not only gamifying that very job it was inspired by, but also using its very mechanics to explore the narrative of state oppression, and challenge a player's morality by presenting the human side of the picture. To those unfamiliar with the game, Papers, Please is the fictional depiction of the Soviet Union, or at least the evocation of that union. You play as an immigration inspector who resides in the communist state of Arstotzkan, following the ending of a 6-year war with a neighboring state. Your job is to man a checkpoint, sifting through documents to dictate whether an immigrant is allowed into the state or not. Things of course escalate from there. As days pass, this already nationalistic state delves further into that nationalism, instating bans, more complicated documents, detaining, and much more. On paper, the game's mechanics may seem tedious. The main loop revolves around sifting through documents, searching for any discrepancies, with efficiency being valued, as the more immigrants allowed into the state, the higher your wages are at the end of the day. However, in practice, it's far from tedious. For the most part, it's rewarding to pass a day without any warnings from your higher-ups. And the way the game introduces complexities to the mechanics was interesting, albeit frustrating if you're in the wrong mood. Depending on the climate of the game, bans can be introduced on immigrants from specific nations. Conditions for entry get more complicated. ID supplements, a work pass, multiple forms of documents. What if the person is an asylum seeker or a diplomat? Those 2 kinds of individuals use an entirely different form of documentation. It's tweaks like these that add further complication to the formula. Sometimes these documents can even be deceiving, and thus need more scrutiny via fingerprints or body scans. Each facet of the game's mechanics spices things up well and keeps things invigorating the further you progress, and it's all incredibly well thought out. What is perhaps pure genius about Papers, Please is how those mechanics immerse the player into the game's setting, as well as explore its narrative of state nationalism. Lucas has successfully done the task of taking a job as disinteresting as document sifting and turning it into an engaging puzzler with original ideas and a strong political message. But was Papers, Please always political? Was it even meant to be a message at all? It all depends how you wish to read the game's subtext. It may seem that the game's creator didn't intend their game to be a political message, but was aware of the setting. In a 2013 interview with Reason, Pope was asked about this. You mentioned in other interviews that you weren't really trying to send a particular political message with your game. How do you balance making a game that's entertaining to play while still creating an appropriately dark mood?
I tried to generalize the political messages to not just be about one situation or regime. I wanted to include elements that could apply to broad situations where it's not always a simple good-evil dynamic at play. I knew the game was going to deal with fairly heavy subjects.
What Pope value in their game was challenging the player's morality, putting the player in a position of power and presenting scenarios to test their humanity. It's understandable for one to see the game in that way. However, it would be disingenuous to say that Papers, Please isn't at all political. What I really appreciate, however, is Pope's awareness of the game's politics. The way things are presented means that a person who doesn't wish to see that side of the game can do so, but the subtext means that discussions of politics and political themes aren't rejected. I am one of those people that chooses to see the game through the lens of politics, A, because I want to, and B, it's very relevant to not just the game, but the topic at large. From a gameplay perspective, all of the previously discussed mechanics are in place to strengthen what Papers, Please ultimately explores: totalitarianism. It's a showcase of the harsh conditions of a strict communist state in the Cold War era, and its downward spiral into totalitarianism. What's particularly interesting about Papers, Please isn't just that it explores dictatorship, but showcases its effects to those who are hurt by it most: the people. Your overarching goal is to earn wages to support your family, to keep a roof under your heads, and to do that you must uphold the values of Arstotzkan. But when you are presented with situations where you are tested, will you keep those morals upheld? Arstotzkan values dominance, power, glory, and that's reflected in how your character interacts with the immigrants that wish to pass. A small example would be how your character responds to allowing a person entry. If it's an Arstotzkan person, you'll say, "Glory to Arstotzkan." Whereas when a non-Arstotzkan person is granted entry, they are told to cause no trouble. Glory to Arstotzkan has arguably become the game's strongest catchphrase, and one that perfectly encapsulates what the game is about. Arstotzkan above all else. While subtle, it reflects the superiority that Arstotzkan instilled in its people, and that superiority over other states is explored adequately through gameplay. As previously mentioned, the further you progress in the game, the more complicated things get. There's more variables you have to scrutinize, such as a person's gender, height, weight, fingerprints, duration of stay. Likewise, you are provided the tools to deal with these contrivances. However, on various days, immigrants from a certain state will be banned from entering or scrutinized more than others. This is contextualized with an event prior to the day of the ban, usually with a terrorist attack. Thus, when immigrants hailing from a certain state arrive at the checkpoint, either further checks are required, or they are outright rejected. This is primarily a way to add challenge to the player, both in terms of gameplay and humanity. These checks give players another element to consider, but also challenges their morality when a person from that scrutinized state is in danger. What if this person in need is trying to escape death? Do you risk your standing with Arstotzkan officials, or uphold the values of Arstotzka and care for yourself? What I find particularly intriguing about these country bans is how it can be read as a form of xenophobia. There's a logical reason to these bans, of course, but one must be aware that it can lead into something worse. Just because a terrorist attack was done by a person from Kalechia, does that mean every Kalechian person is a terrorist? Should we scrutinize every Kalechian person, even disallow them from entering? Isn't it awful to have a person be stripped of their humanity? To have their privacy invaded with something like a body scan just to prove that they aren't a terrorist? Of course, the footage shown here doesn't have full nudity to comply with YouTube, but it shouldn't be too hard to imagine what that may be like. Tangent aside, this is one way to read what are essentially difficulty tweaks in Papers, Please. However, thanks to thoughtful game design, narratives like this one can be explored through gameplay. This reading of xenophobia and invasion of privacy isn't some blurb of exposition. It's something I thought about and made comparisons to thanks to being enveloped in these themes through gameplay. I think it's quite neat to have a game be meaningful with its mechanics. It's surprising to think how uncommon that really is, but if you are looking for it, you'll notice it too. There's plenty of examples of games that don't use their medium to their full advantage, choosing instead to take inspiration from film. You see it in blockbuster AAA games, excessive amounts of time spent on the facets of redundant game design, all in the name of being cinematic. There is another question that Reason asked Pope in that previously mentioned interview, and it is in regard to how an indie dev approaches political or social issues through a game. Pope replied,
"My advice is to focus on the gameplay and integrate it with the message as closely as possible. Don't tell or show something when you can make the player do it themselves."
This is an especially great quote, one that shows just how much attention was put into Papers, Please. In an industry that seems satisfied with spoon-feeding its players half-arsed exposition, it's refreshing to see a developer have a stance on game design that's not only more interesting, but trustful of the player being able to understand their game without being told outright. I like this quote a lot. It's also going to be relevant later on. No matter what you may feel about the game itself, it's safe to say that Papers, Please has left a strong mark in the legacy of video games, being a shining example of how to utilize the medium to its fullest effect. But now we must turn our attention from communism to Great Britain and take a look at a game that follows in the footsteps of Papers, Please, to explore a contemporary nationalistic policy. In an alternative Britain, following the approval of Brexit, a far-right government takes control and rounds up citizens of European heritage to exile them out of the country. You take the role of one of these European citizens, tasked with the goal to survive in this nationalistic hellscape. You take jobs as a bouncer for various events, pubs, concerts, bars. The cards are on the table. The question is, can you earn enough money to stay in Britain? Published by Panic Barn, 2018's Nottonight is a self-described time pressure RPG with a politically charged story where every decision matters. Which is to say, it's a clone of Papers, Please that's had Brexit slapped on it. If you weren't acutely aware of the sprinkles of foreshadowing in the previous segments, my opinion on Nottonight isn't very optimistic. If I had to use 2 words to describe this game, it would be disappointing and frustrating. Perhaps I went in expecting too much, but I didn't want to dislike the game. However, it's certainly let me down. To its credit, there's things the game does right. It's aesthetically pleasing to look at for one. Its gameplay at a basic level is enjoyable, Like Papers, Please, nottonight successfully translates its job into various mechanics and creates a game around it. What's also appreciated is the few changes made to the formula that make a different style of gameplay valued more. Nottonight values speed far more than Papers, Please. In the latter, you took time to sift through documents to be certain of a migrant's validity, whereas in the former, you're skimming over a person's ID card to make sure they are okay for entry. The complexity is instead added via multitasking through multiple queues and some small tweaks depending on the job. Despite the positive impression of the gameplay, there are various aspects that water down the overall experience. This alone wouldn't be cause for alarm. I would have simply written it off as a mediocre game and left it at that. However, in combination with the narrative of this game, it was outright insulting. Delving into the narrative is an entirely different story. However, let's at least look at nottonight's gameplay first, as that's arguably where a lot of the focus is at. This, however, leads into an interesting predicament. It's difficult to look at nottonight on its own merits, because even if I didn't mention the similarities between itself and Papers, Please, Panic Barn make it completely upfront. How can I really look at the game without stopping every other moment to say, X is here just like in Papers, Please? Well, the fault is that nottonight borrows a little too much from its inspiration, to the point where it copies features from Papers, Please for very little reason. There is of course nothing wrong with borrowing mechanics. Games, and media even, constantly references itself, taking ideas that were previously successful and exploring different aspects of said ideas. For an example of games doing just that, one can look at the FPS genre. Since the original Doom, FPS games through the years have borrowed successful ideas from its predecessors and reiterated on its formula time and time again. Take a look at Quake and Half-Life for instance. Both games came out at around the same time, with a 2-year difference between them. Both games feature an extensive arsenal of weapons. Both games feature combat that focuses on the navigation of a playable space, as well as the use of a toolset to effectively eliminate the challenges presented to you. Hell, both games even share the same engine. Half-Life's Gold Source engine is a modified version of Quake's engine. Both share a lot of similarities, but what each game values, and how it uses its mechanics to emphasize those values, is completely different. Quake is a mood piece that took existing mechanics from its time and refined them into the purest form, providing players with a gauntlet in which they test their skill. Half-Life is a narratively driven experience that's focused on environmental storytelling and various set pieces to tell its narrative. This kind of comparison cannot be made between Papers, Please and nottonight, because a lot of the mechanics in the game only exist because the predecessor did so. Why is there a nationality ban? Because Papers, Please did so. Why is there a contraband scanner? Because Papers, Please did so. Why are there livelihood stats that you have to manage in downtime? Because Papers, Please did so. This game goes very far with its mirroring of Papers, Please, to the point where there are literal gameplay segments that are an awful parody of its inspiration. It's not like these features can't work in this game, they can. However, it's the half-arsed effort that results in these features being a mimic of its inspiration. You can see that plain as day if you were to compare how each game handles its mechanics. In Papers, Please, certain nationalities were banned following terrorist attacks. In nottonight, certain nationalities are banned because your employer just wants to keep the Euro evil out. In Papers, Please, tools for contraband scanning exist to suss out immigrants that could be potential terrorists. Again, this happens following a terrorist attack. In nottonight, you get a tool for contraband scanning because people suddenly decided to start carrying knives. In Papers, Please, you spend money between days because the game wants you to experience the poverty of its setting via a measly sum of wages and constantly taking care of your family. In Not Tonight, you have to take care of various stats because there needs to be a money sink. Does it reflect the conditions of the game? Perhaps. But what is the reason for this system? Oh, something NHS privatized. These examples should paint out how even at a gameplay level, Not Tonight isn't well thought out. Ideas that should work exponentially just don't, because of a lack of consideration of the player and making them experience their game. Don't tell or show something when you can make the player do it themselves. Alas, the gameplay is only one half of Not Tonight. There's also the narrative side, more specifically its politics. To understand how I find the politics of Not Tonight frustrating, we need to first look into the basis of the politics and answer the question, why did Brexit happen? June 23rd, 2016. This was a day when votes for the EU referendum took place, with 51% of the UK choosing to leave the EU. This day marks the start of this stupid policy taking its effects. I've always seen Brexit as a bad idea, which isn't an esoteric take. However, I haven't delved further into this policy outside of news headlines and basic research. But thanks to the opportunity provided by this video essay, I'd like to take a deeper look into this subject as a way to strengthen our insight into this topic and better inform my thoughts on Not Tonight's politics. So where did Brexit really begin? Well, musings of referendums date quite far back and in various forms, such as the UK opting out of the Euro in 1999, or the former Labour Party leader, Harold Wilson, promising a referendum as to whether the UK should remain in the European Economic Community in 1974. However, for the sake of brevity, our discussion starts in 2013. Former Prime Minister David Cameron had a speech in which they spoke of being in favour of an in-out referendum.
Simply asking the British people to carry on accepting a European settlement over which they've had little choice is a path to ensuring that when the question is finally put, and at some stage it will have to be, it is much more likely that the British people will reject the European Union. That is why I am in favour of having a referendum.
Arguably, however, the height of the discussion was during 2016 and in the month of February. Our hog-loving Prime Minister blessed us with yet another speech. In it, he outlined the importance of Britain's decision to leave the EU.
We are approaching one of the biggest decisions this country will face in our lifetimes, whether to remain in a reformed European Union or to leave.
Revisiting this period of the referendum years later has kind of strengthened the gravitas of this speech. There are some facets of this video worth pointing out that underline some of the reasoning behind Brexit, as well as subtle ways in which the Conservative Party tries to appeal to a politically ignorant demographic.
I do not love Brussels, I love Britain. I'm the first to say that there are still many ways in which Europe needs to improve, and that the task of reforming Europe does not end with yesterday's agreement. We are Great Britain. We can achieve great things.
Throughout the speech, there is this undertone of British patriotism, presenting the country above the EU. However, to Cameron's credit, he wanted Britain to remain in the EU, and that is also reflected in this statement.
Let me be clear. Leaving Europe would threaten our economic and our national security.
Despite this uncertainty, he was committed to delivering this referendum.
3 years ago, I committed to the British people that I would renegotiate our position in the European Union and hold an in-out referendum. Now I am delivering on that commitment.
He then proceeded to resign following Britain's decision to leave.
But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
So now we have a starting point for Brexit. We know how Brexit began, but we still don't know why. What were some of the reasons a referendum happened, and is there something more to it than just childish whining? Well, I have some theories, my main one being that the many facets of Brexit can be referred back to two overarching themes: economics and nationalism. The economic benefits of Brexit have been advertised quite a lot: jobs, trade, sovereignty, funding for the NHS. Leaving the membership of the EU would allow for so much more potential for Britain. Perhaps it would, but I'm inclined to disagree. A marketing strategy I vividly remember is the benefits our NHS will receive should we leave the EU. This image of a bright red bus with the sentence, "We send the EU 350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead. Vote leave." What is this 350 million in reference to? It may be in reference to a membership fee that the UK pays for. Looking further into this topic suggests that this is indeed a criteria you must fulfill should you wish to have your country be a part of the EU. According to the European Commission's website, financial arrangements are discussed when negotiating. So on the surface, this seems like a good idea. Spend the money that is sent to the EU on our healthcare system, which isn't really in the best shape as of late. The contradiction is that this very government is also responsible for the state the NHS is in. Since 2010, our National Health Service has been experiencing underfunding as a result of spending cuts done by the Tories. The impact of the 2008 financial crisis played a part in the decline of financial spending on the NHS, causing a period of austerity, which has only recently been addressed by the Conservative Party through various pledges and such. Despite that, these imbeciles continue to cut funds to the NHS, with the recent example being Rishi Sunak, Chancellor of Exchequer, coming under fire for taking away £30 billion from the NHS. Where does all this money go? Who knows? For all I know, it may as well be shoved up their fat arses, because they certainly aren't doing anything beneficial with that money. Another talking point I've seen floating around is the idea of sovereignty. Our great nation, released from the reins of a European superstate, free to dictate how the British government chooses to fuck over its citizens. With the UK being out of the EU, sovereignty has been at the forefront of Brexit campaigning, the notion of taking back control. But what are we really taking back control of? Financial control? Control on borders? National interest? The notion of sovereignty seems dangerous in that it has the potential to lead into full-out totalitarianism, and I wouldn't put it past old Boris Boy to do just that. The catalyst for this is, of course, pride. Britain takes pride in its image to the rest of the world. It's a blinding patriotism that underlines the discourse around Brexit. There was a period where Britain had dominance, and that was during the era of the British Empire. Colonialism, the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. Going into this period of time would be padding an already off-tangent part of this video, but it's safe to say that colonialism has seeped its way into our nation's perceptions of ourselves. It arguably bleeds into some of the facets of Brexit. The reasons behind Brexit are flawed, and this is barely scratching the surface of an incredibly dense topic. There is so much potential for commentary. Potential that Not Tonight's narrative doesn't quite grasp. The reason I even did this tangent in the first place was to show where I'm coming from when I say that Not Tonight lacks any nuance with its commentary, and how it fails to portray the future of the UK post-Brexit. The lack of any substantial narrative in Not Tonight is arguably its most disappointing issue, even more so when the ingredients for an insightful commentary were present. However, it would be unfair to just pan a game without considering the intent of the developers. Releasing games is hard, especially for indie developers, and nothing ever goes smoothly. They may have missed the mark with Not Tonight, but surely there was good intentions behind it? Well, there isn't much coverage on this game, surprisingly. At least, nothing worthwhile. I first came across Panic Bomb's About page with some info about them. Nothing really worth noting, aside from that their other releases seem to be sports titles. I kind of wonder, how did a developer primarily focused on creating sports games end up trying their hand at something that feels like it's completely out of their wheelhouse? It seems as though I wasn't the only one wondering this, as in 2018, Panic Bomb did an interview with Jupiter Hadley for Big Boss Battle.
So you went from creating soccer-based games to creating a game about Brexit. What caused this change in focus?
Wanting to make PC games. I really wanted to make something on PC, and the PC audience is definitely more open to niche concepts like Not Tonight.
An interesting response. Their other prominent titles were developed for the mobile platform, so in that sense, yeah, the PC market is more open to topics like Not Tonight, but this doesn't give me much reason as to why they chose to make this game. With Papers, Please, Lucas's initial interest was wanting to take a job, breaking down its various components, and making a game out of it. Here, I'm not sensing much of that interest. Still, hints of personality do spark here and there in the interview.
Why do you feel games should be political?
Not all games, but a political slant can make a game more interesting and potentially raise awareness. In my case, I grew up in southwest England, where the effects of government neglect was apparent.
I can appreciate this about the person being interviewed. The article doesn't name the person representing Panic Bomb, but nevertheless, it's nice to see that someone behind the game wanted to create something based on their experiences as a response to Brexit. Still, it doesn't shake the feeling of uncertainty, like I can't get a sense of the real intent of the developers. Another article that only strengthens that feeling is one written by Hayden Taylor for GameIndustry.biz. This article goes into the controversy of Not Tonight, and how they turned said controversy into opportunity, and it kind of feels bland. Granted, this article was written prior to Not Tonight's release, and I have the hindsight of seeing this game years after, where its reception is more positive, but it doesn't excuse how smug it all feels. Take this quote by Mike Rose, company director of No More Robots, the publisher of the game.
Not Tonight is going to be a super interesting one because it's going to look like on launch day that people have shit on us. We already know how bad the reviews are going to be.
I can't say much with regards to this as I wasn't around for the backlash, but this statement feels a little contradictory when I look back at the previous article discussing a similar topic.
Even without the political angle, you have to get used to criticism when releasing anything to the public.
Of course, these are two completely different people, at different time periods of the game's lifespan, but it feels like the controversy angle was played up just a tad bit. Whatever the case may be, what's important is not the intent itself, but how that's reflected in the final product. You can talk all the talk, but will you walk the walk? In Not Tonight's case, no, they haven't. Not Tonight uses the climate of British politics as an overarching theme, solely to contextualize its gameplay. It's an excuse rather than a baked-in part of the game. A lot of the commentary in Not Tonight's narrative is very surface level. When I previously discussed the reasons for Brexit, I said that they revolve around two overarching themes: economics and nationalism. How Not Tonight explores both aspects isn't all that good. Being that you're a European migrant in the context of the game, the country sees you as a lesser, and so you're struggling to make wages to get by. However, I never felt like that at all. This is perhaps dependent on how well you play, as you receive bonuses the more people you allow into the venue, but there is one mechanic that arguably sizzles out the feeling of financial struggle, and that's the drug dealing system. To be fair, I do like this feature. I'm kind of a sucker for side mechanics that have a little risk to them. But the implementation of this system dampens the financial burden your character goes through, and makes some of the interaction less interesting. Why risk a bribe when you are guaranteed to sell some product and earn a good chunk of money for it? There is risk to this, but arguably the risk isn't that harsh. The nationalism side of the coin isn't explored well either. Anything that references national pride is boiled down to one-dimensional characters saying vaguely racist things against European people. The dark comedy tone that the game wants to go for means that your employers are either cartoonish or just racist in a very bland manner. This is really an issue tied to a later point I want to make, so put a pin on it. Like Papers, Please, nottonight also tweaks its gameplay formula with various modifiers. Some features make sense in the context of the gameplay, such as various queues for guests and VIPs, or certain articles of clothing being banned. Then there are features that would make sense, but are developed very poorly, like the nationality ban. The reasons for these bans are completely paper thin. The owners of any given venue just decide that today is a good day to ban people from X nationalities. There's not much else to really delve into, but there's an interesting point this lack of nationalism exposes, and that's the lack of personality. Not in terms of aesthetic, there's elements that remind the player of the location. I'm talking about a lack of British culture. I often felt that the game was hollow, and the reason is that lack of personality, particularly through dialogue, because there's nothing that makes it unique to Britain. There's no slang, no references to British culture. Even the comedy itself doesn't have that dry sense of humour that's unique to British people. With Papers, Please, it can be afforded some disbelief because it's set in fiction. It's also based on a time period where less people would be aware of the culture and atmosphere of the Soviet Union. With nottonight, however, it's set in a real place, and that lack of uniqueness really hinders the overall experience. If it weren't for the imagery and the vaguely English-sounding gibberish, this setting could easily be replaced with something else. There's the argument that a focus on British culture would alienate everyone else, but even still there is some familiarity with our culture in an international audience. I mean, the existence of memes and stereotypes making fun of our culture shows that. And at the end of the day, this focus on British culture isn't to educate on said culture, but to immerse the player in its setting. Arguably the strongest component of nottonight that isn't capitalized on is the perspective. In Papers, Please, you play as a government official, and while the game revolves around the people affected by the politics, the position a player is in means they're still a little bit detached from the people that migrate. In nottonight, you are part of the affected group. You are viewing the effects of Brexit from the perspective of regular street folk. You aren't working for a government, you're working to scrape by. However, that perspective is squandered, one of the main reasons being how contradictory and nonsensical progression of the narrative gets. I mean, how is a bouncer, a European bouncer of this supposed nationalistic Britain, end up as an immigration officer for said nationalistic Brits? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think your skills as a bouncer can transfer into border control. Yes, games are games and all, but even if we disregard this issue with the jobs, why is your character, a person that's being scrutinized by the system, helping said system? Perhaps the point is to show off the irony of the immigration policies of Brexit, but it doesn't work. Even the reason for this change in tone seems paper thin. It just so happens that one particular officer has a thing for you and as such gives you government-related jobs? One way this narrative could have worked is if your character was instead a British citizen who voted to remain in the EU. Just imagine your player character living in a Britain where European discrimination is rampant, and you either have to conform or risk being exiled yourself. Your character has to juggle their personal feelings on Brexit with the forced harsh reality of their situation. Sadly, my little concept isn't the reality. What is the point I'm trying to make? Why go through all the trouble to explore the policies of Brexit to talk about a game that essentially doesn't do much with it? Well, surprisingly, it's not to bash the game. I know I come off as harsh, but a lot of it comes from expectation. The idea of a game that explores the fallout of Brexit sounds really intriguing, but for a number of different reasons it doesn't follow through, and it just kinda sucks to see these cool ideas and concepts sell themselves short, for whatever the reason may be. Alas, there is nothing more than that, ideas that never come through, and the final product we get was something that left me disappointed. Games are a wonderful medium. They have the potential to allow people to experience a concept or idea through interaction. But games are also hard to develop, and sometimes they don't work, and nottonight is one of them. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe the development team was focused on the wrong aspects. There are many reasons as to why things turned out the way they did for me. I think what made nottonight falter was the attempts in imitating a concept, but failure to build on it. It captures the gameplay of Papers, Please, but that's all it really has to its name. It doesn't stand on its own without that inspiration. And that is how you explore nationalism through games. Wrong. In any case, thank you for watching this video. Likes, comments, and subscriptions are appreciated. Thank you again to all these lovely people for narrating the quotes. These are the links to their respective platforms if you wish to see more of their stuff. Until next time, take care.